Do they have other options up there? Okay, so yeah. Interesting. We still have our old part.
Okay, let's continue. So we have done a little bit so far. We've written our help or info for this script, and we did some initialization. And then the next step that makes some sense is to take care of the location of the data, because the thing, if you think about it, fMRI data pre-processing has been done many times previously, and it's fairly standardized. What's always different and what you always need to tell any algorithm that you use to process some data is to where the data is actually located on your machine. And or on a drive or something. So you need to basically specify which data should be pre-processed, analyzed, or whatever. And to this end, we know that we will have, of course, you need to think a little bit about what you have, and we know that we will have hierarchy files from different participants, and either in this non-bit structure or also in the bit structure, the data sets from individual participants in fMRI are saved in individual folders. That's also now the bits standard. Of course, there's no need to do that, but that's often how it's done. And in this regard, we also know that these folders for the individual participants' data are in a folder called data. And as we also discussed, that we do the pre-processing and actually also the first level GLM estimation on a participant basis, it makes sense to structure the whole data management business into this. There's one folder which has all the data, and then there are many folders which have the data of individual participants. So this kind of hierarchy makes sense to reflect that on the level of or in your script. Would be different if everything would be in one folder, but then you would have to still have this kind of hierarchy in the file names or something. So it makes some sense to structure it like that. And then, especially if you have these things that you have one folder, and in this folder you have more folders which have detailed data, then of course it makes sense to keep these things separately so that you can basically build paths that then use a component that refers to the overall location and one component that refers to the more detailed location. So in this sense, we specify now some folders. Let's call one folder. It's not really with these acronyms. I always struggle because they should be meaningful, but then if you start thinking about it, whatever. So I call this now the source directory, by which I mean this overall directory. How could one call it else? Highest level directory, whatever. I call it source directory. It's kind of a typical thing. And then I call the participant directories, maybe let's call them participants, don't know. Let's call it PAT. Looks a little bit like patient, but it's also patient is not completely wrong. So this should be the overall directory. Does anyone has a better name for the overall? Let's call it DAT. Yeah, let's call it DAT. Let's call it DAT directory. I like this one. That's the data directory, and then in the data directory we have the participant directories. So the data directory, there are different ways how you can specify it. I would ideally assume that somebody who uses the script later on can download this from, for example, OSF or GitHub, and then when I share it, I would leave this free, so not put anything in. The script will not run in this case, but the thing is that this needs to be adapted anyway for the individual user, so it makes sense to document what this should be. This is the common data directory for participant data folders, for example. It's more important that you write anything than how clear it is. And the way one can do that is, of course, one can also somehow build this in some interesting way, but one can also just specify it once and for all. So it's a little long. So it's not that nice because it goes further than the little line. I always try to keep things within the limits of this line, but if that doesn't work, sometimes I'm a little bit lenient and leave it like that. This needs to be specified by you, so if you have a different location, then you need to specify that. Good. So the participant directories, there we currently obviously only have one participant directory, but we can imagine that we will have more. So we use a cell structure to specify that, because in cells you can put in strings. And currently the participant that we have is folder that we have is this. Then later on we might add to that. So now we have specified essentially just the location of this. So if we now tell the script something, it knows where this is if we concatenated the core in a nice way. Good. Then we might also specify, actually in this case, the data run numbers that we want to pre-process. So we are currently interested in pre-processing the FMI data, and you know that the fourth and the fifth run were FMI data. Again, this is something that you that ideally is documented somewhere. So you see that this file is CB4, so we can use this 4 later on. We can use the 5, the 6 also. The 7 is the resting state run. We could also pre-process that, but we are not interested in this currently. So we now specify 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9. Ideally, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9. Ideally, we should document that, of course. Participant directories. Participant directory stubs. These little things are called stubs, and this would be the participant specific run numbers. Ideally, your data collection goes so smooth that these numbers are always the same for all participants. Then you don't need this participant specific version. but that depends a little bit on how smooth things went and so on. So ideally, though, and in standardized data sets, you would not have to. You would only specify that once, or you have numbers 1 to 5 or something. But maybe you need to specify it. Good. So essentially, what we've now specified is that there's a participant directory 12DO. We want to pre-process this 4, 5, 6, 8, 9. That's fine. But yeah. So now essentially we could. Not used to not seeing the whole thing. Yeah, specific. What do I want to say? I don't know. Anyway, so we could now run things based on that. And the way we will do it is because we know that we will do many participants. We will write a for loop. And use E as the running variable and use the number of elements in the participant directory cell structure as the end. So we run from 1 to the number of participants essentially and do the analysis for each one individually. So to do the analysis, which in this case is pre-processing, we write another function that we call cb fmri pre-process, for example, that actually does the pre-processing. Yeah? So we consider what we've just written, this function, as the batch function, and as a sub-function we specify more details, because we then write a function that does the pre-processing as a function of the specific participant. Yeah? So, of course, we need to, when we want to do that, also specify again what this function does. We can use a little bit of help from this, because this actually saves a little bit of time and it does the same thing essentially, but we have to adapt it. So this function is a batch script. Now it's not a batch script, it's a script for pre-processing single participant fMRI data. It's still related to the checkerboard project. And actually the work that we want to do now remains the same. So it does this, and the mother function also does this, but now we will have some inputs. And as inputs, we will, I guess, use a structure. It's a little bit, so in general, I now always use structures as inputs because it's nicer. And we call the structure, maybe we want to call it S. Let's call it S. S is an input structure. And you know that the subparts of structures are called fields. And in the fields we put the info that we need. So one field we call, how do we call it up here? Dot directory. And then we can of course use same documentation. Common data directory for participants. participant folders. Let's try to keep it with only until this line. Yeah, that's the dat.dir, and then we use, of course, the pat.dir participant specific data folder, and then what else do we have? How do we call it? Run dir? That doesn't make any sense. Run dir? Well, we can call it run dir because we will actually create run specific directories, so it makes sense to call this run dir, run specific data folder numbers. So in principle, you should also specify a little bit more what kind of variable types these things are. If we make this a little bit, so just for the purpose, you could write something like string, and this would be a 1x5 array. Yeah? So that the user knows what, or the person looking at your script knows what these things are. One can, and this is something maybe also to mention, that one can, of course, if one writes really professional code, in the sense that one writes code for things, if one writes code essentially if one writes code for people that don't know what's going on. So if you write, for example, code for Windows, for Word or something, where people don't know what's going on because they don't interact with the code, then you would have to make sure that these input arguments, that you actually test them, so that you put into your code tests that if for example, the data directory is not specified as a string, in this case it will just crash. And you could make it better in the sense that if it's not a string, so you could put in a test in the beginning of the script that if this is not string, display or print, please input a string, and then do a while loop and so on. These kind of things I don't do in my code, because this would be a lot of overhead, which is just there for essentially people that interact blindly with the code. And I don't write code for people that interact blindly with the code, but I write code to document what I'm actually doing. And this is documented, and that's it. So I'm not testing the input arguments here. Outputs, for the moment, I think there would be none. Saves data to this is the same. Good. And it does these things. Now, if this has input, we need to give it this input. And that also means that we have to put in the input here. But S is not defined yet, so we need to specify S. And then it makes sense if you are using this in kind of this hierarchical way and use a structure in a for loop to always initialize the structure again, so that because if it's not deleted, it's just only some parts might be adapted in the for loop in this initialized structure. So this command makes sure that the structure that you will put into the CVA FMI process, preprocess thing, starts empty. So this is how to create an empty structure. And then you have to specify the fields of the structure. So s.dir, if you want to use them, s.dir would be what we have called .dir, as pat.dir. This, of course, would now be the specific string that applies to the current participant, and this would be I, so it's adaptive according to the for loop. And the sRunDir again is adaptive to the for loop and would be rundir I. So So let's again document this. Oops, that was maybe a little bit too much. I want to have the font size large, but that means that I don't see everything at the same time. Oops. So that's the common data directory. That's the current and that's the current so, and then one can comment here a little bit. I try to avoid actually these kind of do this comments. So I think the only thing where I still use it is to document for loops, but otherwise it feels a little bit strange that if you always write define input structure, put thing there. So it's somehow nicer if you just say what it is. This is the input structure definition. And this is, I'm doing this the whole day, so I think a lot about these things. So this is participant data pre-processing. So, and now it's a good time to check that this is actually running. So you know I love keyboard. If you like these debugging things more, that's up to you. So let's see whether the code so far runs. I'm in the wrong folder. Currently it's initializing SPM. Good. And then it ran, then it did the initial code that we programmed, and now we are in this function, in the workspace of this function. What variable do we expect in the workspace of this function? So if I type whos, what will we get? What have we passed to this function?
If you type whos, it tells you what your variables are.
Yeah, but what do we pass to the function in which we are currently in?
Data directory.
Yeah, but what kind of, which variable do we use to do that?
String.
Yeah, look at the code again. So if I type whos, what will we get?
Structure.
Yeah, and what's the structure called?
S.
Exactly. So because we passed this in, what we now have in the workspace is S, which is a structure, and then we can look at, I think that's command to look at the fields of the structure. Yeah, and then these are cell arrays, and the fields are called data directory, participant directory, and run directory. That's the name of the fields. And if we look what is in there, then of course the field .dir, or not of course, but hopefully has our common folder directory, as pat.dir has our current participant, and as run.dir has these numbers. Yeah? So they are now available to this function. Currently it has this mark because Oh no, it says what it is, but it also it's kind of the warning that it's not being used. Oh, we will use it, so it shouldn't worry. You should be a little bit patient. Good, and then before we actually start importing the data, we should also do some data management at the participant level. So we start with some data management. Because, as I said, currently, so let me show you why we are doing this and what I mean. So currently, all the parec files are in one folder, and when I imported one run, I put them into in its own folder. And this kind of folder, so the level of having folders specific to runs in FMI is also relatively natural, because you know that if you go further down the hierarchy of FMI data, then a natural unit are runs, and then the next natural unit are, of course, volumes. Again, one doesn't need to do it, but it keeps the whole thing somewhat structured, and it makes sense. So we do it. And also bits is based on this run specific folder structure. So we want actually to have these folders. So we can actually we'll do it here. Yeah, I think that. So we do it. Raw, this makes some sense. So we have now two options. Either we, I think we do it like this because that's a little nicer. I think, so we do it like this. So we do, what we actually want is in the end to have the whole thing look like this. Let's get rid of this. We want the whole thing to look like this. If we go to subject 12, we want a folder where we have the behavioral data, where we have the GLM data, and where we have the files associated with the pre-processing. We will actually move the parec into this later on, or we can also leave it here. It's the raw data, it doesn't really matter. In the pre-processing folder, we will do these, this we will save again, but there we will do our run folders. So we save the data in runs, but because this is all related to pre-processing, we will do the folders in here, which also allows us to get rid of everything once we have started something. So there's a question?
Yes, so currently we have the behavior data for ING, and then we add for GLM and the folder.
Currently, I'm just doing FMI, so EEG is not considered here at all, and I would keep that separate because this is FMI data analysis.
So we would have a folder FMI with all the raw files.
The raw data. So these are two things. The raw data, which would be in bits format, this you should have somewhere because you want to share it with the world. So that's the bits raw data. And what we are currently programming, and all these folders are in, they are in what bits called derivatives. So this is separate from the bits thing. So there we would actually, if we had already converted the stuff to bits, these parec files, they would not be in this, there won't be parec files, and they will not be in this location. They will be somewhere else, essentially somewhere here, and the data analysis would then go there too. use the data. That's how the bits wants the raw data separate from the derivatives. This is easily adapted later on, and currently we have the PyRec in here. The good thing about this is the following, that if we use this structure, we can now first set up a participant directory. For pre-processing. And we do this as follows. So full file puts together parts of paths, and what you don't have to do is to concatenate these explicitly or put in the folder separators, so the backslashes or normal slashes if you're on a Linux system and so on. So full file is helpful, and we want to put together a participant directory that what we actually want, and this is often also how I do it, we want to create this string here, this folder. Well, that doesn't help much. Let's get rid of that. To this end, we now concatenate the root directory and the participant directory. And before we go any further, we check that this actually does something. Let's see whether it always takes long. Yeah, I will turn off the fact that we always add SPM and initialize it in a second, because then we get quicker with the debugging. So now we have the participant directory in our function, and it's called this, which we actually want. But what we also want is that it's called pre, because that's where we want to put in our run directories. So let's do it a little bit nicer and more streamlined. So, and then we use the MATLAB directory and data management tools to do the following. First of all, if this directory exists, then we delete it, because we want to make sure that if we run this thing, that there's no interaction between parts of pre-processing that have been done before or not, and so on, and everything gets confusing. So the first thing that the function does when it pre-processes is that it erases everything that was there previously, and then it creates a new folder that is called this. And this is what we then do. There is this MATLAB function exist, which can check whether something exists. And if you look into how this function works, so you need to, that's not the case, I do exist, at least I think so. If you specify dir, it checks whether this exists as a directory, because it can also check whether things exist as files. So let's see what happens. So if we run this, I should have get rid of the SPM stuff, because this just takes time. So now it finally got to the function, and we are now in the case that this is positive, and this is due to the fact, of course, that this directory exists. And now we manually delete it, and also get rid of this SPM business here. So this is when you are debugging, and you should always debug when you're programming, so and test stuff. You can, of course, comment out stuff, but make sure that everything, if you share scripts, that you don't share commented out codes. That's one of the worst things that I see in code, when I download code from somebody else and then half of the code is commented out and you're like, what? Is this used or not? So don't do that. So now let's run it again. Now it's much quicker because we don't go through the whole SPM setup. And now we are here because I just deleted this directory. Now, if it exists, however, we want to remove it, because whatever is there under this name we want to get rid of. And I see that here we pass in S. Let's see what that means. Okay, S indicates that the subdirectory tree implied by directory will be removed recursively. So that means that we remove everything, which is good. So if it exists, remove a little bit strange, because we can just simplify this. The code that I see is a little bit redundant. So if this exists, remove it. If it doesn't exist, there's nothing to remove, and this will not happen. So we can use make dir to create our directory. So currently it's not there. Now it's there. It's like magic. It's a little bit like magic. So now we are sure that whenever we run this function, if we have done some preprocessing, everything gets deleted and we start from scratch, and it's all very nice. Good. So then maybe we get actually to the import. Maybe not. Let's see. Iterate over participant specific, but that's clear. Over what time is it? Oh, I know we have to leave, I think, soonish. I think then we stop here. I will now, of course, also share the code and put this online. Just because currently it's not online, so that you can look at it. So we've done, I think, now most of the overhead that one should do to make everything clean, and then next time we use this thing here to import, and then we can use the whole structure that we've now created with this participant specific and so on for the remaining things like realignment and the other stuff. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah?
The keyboard command asks you to enter something with the keyboard.
Yeah, and so the keyboard command stops the execution of the code and gives you control of the current workspace in the command window. So it's good for checking what you currently have. You can also do this with this debugging tool, so you get the same thing. But I somehow was raised on this keyboard thing, and then you can investigate what you currently have in your workspace. As I told you in the winter term, I always do things in functions so that the workspace only has as variables always what you actually need and not everything that has been specified somewhere else. And then so it stops there and lets you investigate what you currently have in your workspace. And you should always investigate that, although you might be able to investigate that differently, but so that if things don't work, that's usually due to the fact that something is not currently specified correctly, and then you need to investigate what the problem is. Yeah, any other questions? No. Good, then let's continue next week.